All right, this video is going to go over counting atoms in chemical formulas using subscripts, coefficients, and parentheses. All right, so first we're going to be talking about using subscripts, and my subscripts will be in red. All right, so first we need a chemical formula to work with. I'm going to choose water, so H2O, because you guys are familiar with water. And what I like to do whenever I'm looking at a chemical formula is I like to break down the different elements that are inside of it first. So remember, with each capital letter is a new element. So in this case, I have a capital H and a capital O, which means I have hydrogen and oxygen in this formula. All right, so now I'm going to count how many atoms of each. So I'm going to look at hydrogen first. There's a small 2 behind it, which is my subscript, which means there are 2 atoms of hydrogen in this chemical formula. Now I'm going to look at my O, and there's nothing behind it. So whenever there is no subscript or small number behind it, that means there's just one of those. So no subscript means 1. All right, so I only have 1 oxygen in this formula. Now, a lot of the times it'll ask you how many total atoms there are. So, total number of atoms. In this case, there's 2 hydrogen and 1 oxygen, so that means there are 3 total atoms. All right, so the next thing we're going to talk about is using subscripts and coefficients. So, and my coefficients are going to be in purple. And coefficients. All right, so coefficients are just going to be the big number at the beginning of a formula. And I will write an example now. Formula. Ooh, spelled formula wrong. All right, so in this example, I'm going to have 2 H2 SO4. So the coefficient is just this big 2 that is in front of the chemical formula. And as I stated in the first example, I like to write out the different elements that I see. So I have a big H, which means I have hydrogen. I have an S for sulfur. And then since there's a capital O behind it, that is oxygen. So I have 3 capital letters, which means I have 3 elements. All right, so I like to look at the coefficients first because the coefficient tells you how many total molecules I have of these. So the coefficient actually affects everything behind it. So this 2 is going to affect the hydrogen, the sulfur, and the oxygen. So I like to write out coefficients first, so I know that each element is going to start off with at least times 2. And now I can look at them separately. So my hydrogen, if I look at it by itself, I have 2 of those thanks to the coefficient. My sulfur, remember there's nothing behind it, so that just means 1. And then my oxygen has 4. And I cover that up because once I write my 2 down, I'm done using that coefficient. So I have everything written out, and I just need to find the total of each. So hydrogens, 2 times 2 is 4, so I have 4 hydrogens. Sulfur, 2 times 1 is 2, so I just have 2 sulfurs still. And then oxygen, 2 times 4 is 8, which means I have 8 total oxygens. Now I can add those all up and get the total number of atoms, which is 14, because 8 plus 2 is 10, 10 plus 4 is 14. Right? So now we're going to throw some parentheses in there. And just like math, parentheses affects everything inside the parentheses, or the subscript behind the parentheses affects everything inside of it. So our third example here, we're going to be using, in my parentheses, I'm going to put in blue. All right, so I'm going to write my chemical formula. Let's do Al2 SO4. Now I can go ahead, I'm going to put my parentheses right here around the S and the O, and then my subscript behind it is going to be 3. So, as I said earlier, the subscript only affects what is inside the parentheses. So this 3 is behind the parentheses, which means it affects the S and the O. Since the Al, or aluminum, is not inside the parentheses, it does not affect the Al. All right, so I'm going to break down my elements. So Al is aluminum. Sulfur is S. And then O is oxygen. All right. So aluminum. I have 2 of those. And then I'm going to go ahead and look at this part inside the parentheses without the subscript behind it. So for sulfur, I start off with 1. And then for oxygen, I have 4. All right, now I'm going to throw in the parentheses. Aluminum is not inside the parentheses, so it's going to just stay at 2. Now the sulfur is inside, and the subscript behind the parentheses is 3, which means that sulfur atom gets multiplied times the 3, and then oxygen is also inside of the parentheses, which means I have to multiply that as well. All right, so for the total number, I still have 2 aluminum. Sulfur, I have the 1 times 3, which is this 3. And the oxygen, I had 4, and then my parentheses was 3, so 4 times 3 is 12. So my total atom count of atoms is 17. All right, so the very last thing we're going to go over is using all of these in one chemical formula. But once again, I'm going to color code them. My subscripts are going to be red, my coefficients are going to be purple, and my parentheses are going to be blue. So this is going to break it down. Put my page here. All right. So actually, let me do it right here so we can't see the stuff behind it. So we are going to be using subscripts. Coefficients. and parentheses all at once. All right, so I'm going to first write down the formula for my examples. Let's do AL 2 SO 4. Oops, that's supposed to be red. Pretend that is 4. And then I'm going to throw my parentheses around here. I'm going to use the subscript 3 again. And then my coefficient is going to be 2. All right, so before I even get into the numbers, I want to write down my elements. I have 3 capital letters, which means I have 3 elements. So I have aluminum again. I have sulfur. And I have oxygen. All right, so let's break it down. First, we know our subscripts affect what's behind it, or what's in front of it. And then let's look at our coefficients. So this 2 is in front, which means it affects this whole thing. So it's going to affect my aluminum, my sulfur, and my oxygen. So let's go ahead and get that out of the way and put the 2 for each element. All right, now they're going to be multiplied. And now we can ignore this 2 and continue looking. Now let's look at our subscripts for each element. So aluminum has a 2 behind it, and it's not inside the parentheses, so it's fine. Sulfur, without looking at the parentheses, there is 1 atom. And then oxygen, once again, not looking at the parentheses, there are 4 of those. All right, and then we keep going. All right, aluminum, there is nothing in parentheses, so we're done with aluminum. Now we're going to look at our parentheses, and remember that affects anything inside of it, so it's going to affect our sulfur and our oxygen. So the number behind the parentheses is 3 for sulfur and 3 for oxygen. Now we can multiply those and get our total for each element. So 2 times 2 is 4, so there are 4 total aluminums. 2 times 1 is 2, times 3 is 6. We have 6 sulfurs. And then oxygens, 2 times 4 is 8. 8 times 3 is 24. So overall, in this chemical formula, we have 4 aluminums, 6 sulfurs, and 24 oxygens. So our total for this would be 34 atoms. All right, I hope the color coding helped you out. And I know this is confusing, but it just takes practice, I promise.